The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of blackness broken only by the faint yellow beam of Hal Warren's headlights. It was late, close to midnight, as he drove along Highway 93 through southern Idaho. The radio offered no comfort, just static and the occasional crackle of a far-off country station. He'd been on the road for hours, heading south toward Twin Falls, and the isolation was starting to weigh on him. Hal glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. He sighed, flexing his hands on the steering wheel to shake off the stiffness. The desert's emptiness was eerie at night, the flat land merging with the starless sky in an indistinct blur. He hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and the sense of solitude was beginning to feel oppressive. He told himself to focus. "It's just another late-night drive," he muttered. "Nothing to it." But there was a strange sensation creeping over him, a feeling he couldn't quite name, like he was being watched. He dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue and the unrelenting monotony of the drive. Then the headlights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a faint dimming, but it made Hal's stomach clench. He tapped the dashboard as if that might fix the problem. The lights steadied for a moment, then flickered again, this time more noticeably. The engine made a low, sputtering noise, and Hal felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. "Come on, don't do this," he whispered, glancing nervously at the fuel gauge. The tank was half full. It wasn't the gas. But the engine's stuttering grew louder, and the headlights dimmed to a sickly yellow glow. Then, without warning, the world around him changed. At first, Hal thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The highway, the desert, the distant mountains, all of it seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The yellow lines on the asphalt blurred, and the sky shifted from inky black to a strange, deep gray. The stars, previously obscured, reappeared, but they were different, larger, brighter, and arranged in unfamiliar constellations. The radio crackled, and for a moment, Hal thought he heard voices. Low, guttural whispers interspersed with bursts of static. He reached for the dial to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an unintelligible cacophony. The clock on the dashboard blinked, then reset. 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock. Hal gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The air inside the car felt heavy, oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. His breathing grew shallow, and a faint ringing filled his ears. Then the car stopped. Not just the engine, everything. The tires no longer hummed against the asphalt. The vibration of the engine disappeared. Even the faint rustle of wind against the windows ceased. It was as if the entire world had been paused. Hal sat frozen, staring ahead at the road. Or what used to be the road. The asphalt had vanished, replaced by a smooth, glass-like surface that reflected the strange, glowing stars above. He couldn't tell where the ground ended and the sky began. "What the hell?" he whispered. His voice sounded muffled, as though he were speaking underwater. For a few agonizing moments, nothing happened. Hal's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Then, slowly, the glass-like surface began to ripple. He watched in stunned silence as the ripples spread outward, distorting the reflections of the stars. Shapes began to emerge from the ripples, shadowy, indistinct figures that seemed to shift and writhe as they moved closer. Hal's instinct was to run, but where could he go? The car was dead, and the world beyond was unrecognizable. He gripped the door handle, his fingers trembling, but hesitated. The figures were closer now, their shapes becoming more defined. They were tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved in unnatural, jerky motions. Their faces, if they could be called that, were featureless voids, blacker than the surrounding darkness. One of them stopped directly in front of the car. Hal felt its gaze, though it had no eyes. The pressure in the air increased, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure raised a spindly arm and pointed at him. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled Hal with a terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Leave me alone," he choked out, though he knew it was futile. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. Then, in a sudden, jerking motion, it disappeared, followed by the others. The oppressive weight lifted, and Hal gasped for air, his chest heaving. The world around him shifted again. The glass-like surface rippled once more, and the reflections of the stars dissolved. The asphalt reappeared beneath the car, the familiar yellow lines glowing faintly in the dim light. The engine roared back to life, and the headlights brightened. Hal's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely keep the car on the road. The clock on the dashboard still blinked 12 o'clock. He reached for his wristwatch, desperate for a sense of normalcy, but it, too, had stopped. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figures following him, but the road behind was empty. The desert stretched on as it had before, silent and still. Hal pressed down on the accelerator, his only thought to get as far away from this place as possible. The next 2 hours were an eternity. Hal's eyes darted constantly between the road and the rearview mirror, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The oppressive feeling lingered, though it was less intense. He couldn't shake the sensation that something had shifted, that he no longer belonged entirely to the world he knew. When he finally reached the outskirts of Twin Falls, the clock on the dashboard blinked once, then resumed its normal function. 2:47 a.m. Hal pulled into a brightly lit gas station, his hands still trembling as he parked. He stumbled out of the car and into the harsh fluorescent light, the normalcy of the setting almost overwhelming. The attendant, a young man with curly hair and a bored expression, looked up from his magazine. "You okay, buddy?" he asked. Hal opened his mouth to respond but found he couldn't. How could he explain what had happened? He simply nodded, bought a cup of coffee, and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the highway ahead. In the days that followed, Hal tried to make sense of the experience. He scoured newspapers and local reports for any mention of strange occurrences in the desert but found nothing. He considered telling someone, a friend, a colleague, but what could he say? That he'd been transported to another dimension? That he'd encountered beings that defied explanation? Eventually, he decided to let it go. But the experience left its mark. Hal never drove through the southern Idaho desert at night again. And though he tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of his exhausted mind, a part of him knew the truth. The desert held secrets, and for 2 agonizing hours, he had been trapped within one of them.